For teachers to design a good lesson, they must understand that competencies are the core of designing contents, activities, and assessments. The competencies represent the lifelong skills expected for every Filipino learner to master and become a way of life. When teachers understand the competencies, they will be able to utilize these competencies into smart objectives, meaningful activities, and appropriate assessment. Let us all learn today in understanding the most essential learning competencies. You may subscribe for more sessions and learning. For this session, we're expected that we can communicate very well the very essence of the competencies, that we can discuss the importance of the most essential learning competencies in teaching learning delivery. We can explain the relevance of cognitive process dimensions to the different learning competencies, and we can evaluate our own practice in assessing congruency of competencies to expected cognitive process dimensions. During the first round of monitoring this year, these are the common findings from the series of document analysis from the developed materials. First, competencies delivered weekly are not arranged logically according to the taxonomy of learning. There are competencies in the first few weeks that started with difficult activities and outputs and eventually ended the quarter with the most basic skill requirement. For the example, it started with compare and contrast, which is already analysis part, and it ended with identify, which is basically remembering. Second, learning objectives are not congruent to the competencies. Some lessons have goals which are far from the targets of the competencies. In this example, learners are only required to give the ending of the story, but the objectives require learners to find the ending of the story and to ingest personal feelings about the story which are far beyond the competency expectation. Parang ang konsepto ay ganito. Ang competency requirement lang ay kinakailangang mahasa ang mag-aaral sa pagluluto ng chiffon cake. Pero sa ginawa nating layunin, ang patutunguhan ng bata ay makagawa ng isang moist cake. So, hindi nagtugma ang competency at ang objective. And that makes it a problem because there is now a mismatch between the competency and the objectives, and eventually a mismatch to the activities and assessment. The third one is that activities in the learning activity sheets did not coincide with the objectives. In this example, the objective requires the learner to give the ending of the story being read, but the activity was just giving a one-line situationer and not a story. The inconsistency of the objectives and the activities will lead confusion to learners as to what skills will be mastered, since this competency requires the development of reading comprehension and critical analysis. The activity itself did not satisfy the objective and the competency. Fourth on the list is assessments are not congruent to the competency requirements. In most cases, our assessment did not coincide the competency or skill requirements. In this finding, the competency requires the learner to infer feelings of the characters in the dialogue. The assessment expected to allow the learners to master making inference on the emotions of characters, as this is one of the most difficult skills in language subjects. The activity did not coincide with the competency requirement because it allowed the students to revise the fable and change the character. Revising and changing the character of the story is not congruent to the competency, which is inferring the feeling of characters based on the dialogues heard. So, what is now the problem? Is it the understanding of the most essential learning competencies? Or is it the utilization of the most essential learning competencies? Our Our most essential learning competencies are guided by both levels of learning and levels of assessment. Meaning, the competencies are not standalone statements, but it is guided by a scaffolding approach that runs from basic concepts to complex products. This also means that when we design our lessons and activities, we have to be guided by levels of learning, and when we design our assessment, we have to be guided by the levels of assessment. These levels of learning and levels of assessment are also known as cognitive process dimension. This dimension represents the learning patterns of the child in absorbing the knowledge and skills through scaffold activities of learning concepts to ideas and products. Psychologically, this represents that delivery of learning must be progressive and gradual. The abrupt introduction of the competency will eventually contribute to learning failures. Thus, competencies must be introduced from easy to average and difficult level to allow every learner to cope up with the competency demands. Teachers must put premium on considerations of these levels of learning and levels of assessment, specifically in designing learning activity materials. Both levels of learning and assessment must be congruent to ensure that learning is holistic and lifelong. When teachers fail to classify what levels are required by every competency, then learning activity materials produced and assessment designs are not inclusive, and eventually learning outcomes are sacrificed. The critical part here is that teachers must be very careful in understanding the requirements of the competencies before designing the lesson. In understanding the learning competencies, teachers must get to know what is the level of each competency. They must be very careful in classifying every competency across the 6 cognitive process dimensions. And when teachers already know the specific level, they can now design lessons, activities, and assessment congruent to the competency requirement. Teachers as well might consider the placement of competencies from easy, average, to difficult level. This arrangement will allow students to scaffold their learning across the levels of difficulty. So, in order to classify the competencies into appropriate levels, we need to map first the set of competencies within the quarter. This is through identifying what cognitive process dimensions or level of learning each competency requires. By simply using this pattern, we can identify appropriate competencies, levels of learning and assessment, requirement in a particular week it will be delivered. And part of it also is we can identify what forms of summative assessment can be given in a particular competency in a certain week. And by this mapping, we can assure that from the competencies identified, the learning activity materials and assessment are congruent and relevant. When mapping the competencies, we need to consider the number of weeks over the number of competencies. Since the third quarter has 8 weeks, 7 weeks will be provided with learning activity sheets, and the 8th week will be allotted for major assessment activities. For competencies, which are too many in a quarter, we need to combine or merge specifically these competencies with common grounds to satisfy the number of weeks for lesson delivery. And for competencies which are too limited, lesson developers may extend the competency delivery by expanding the objectives and number of activities, specifically for competencies having higher level requirements. Teachers must be careful in looking at the competencies to be considered for expansion. There is no need to create sub-competencies. We only need objectives and activities to be stretched in a week or combined weeks. In mapping the competencies, teachers must be guided with the taxonomy of learning. The taxonomy of learning defines the level of competency requirements. These are some sort of review on the levels of assessment and levels of understanding referring to our most essential learning competencies. When the competency requires only a simple recall, then it is level 1. This means that we don't need complicated lessons, activities, and assessments because the competency requirement only allows learner to develop the memory and retention of the lesson. Level 2 is when the competency requires learners to demonstrate their understanding of the lessons. The lesson developer will focus now on how learners discuss and explain the concepts presented during the lesson. The teacher will design activities and assessment that will allow the learners to discuss and explain the concepts they learned. Level 3 is when the competency requires learners to have application of learning to practical situations. When the competency requires application, teachers must design activities and assessment that will manifest application of learners about his takeaways from what he understood from the lesson, may be conceptual or realistic. The application may include how rules, methods, concepts, principles, and theories can be applied in a similar situation in life. Level 4 is when the competency requires learners to break information into parts and explore these parts to become whole again. The teachers as lesson developers must consider how they will provide activities and output requirements that could measure critical thinking. This level of competency allows the learners to analyze the pieces of information and form conclusions based on the evidences gathered and analyzed. Level 5 is when the competency requires learners to evaluate through reflection, critiques, and judgment. The activities and assessment to be designed by teachers as competency requirements must focus on how learners will justify a course of decision or actions based from the concepts, perspectives, and ideas presented. The lesson must allow them to weigh in their judgment, and their outputs must show competence in managing decisions because that is what the competency requires them to master. And lastly is level 6, when the competency requires learners to create new ideas, new products, and new innovations from a certain point of view reflected from the different perspectives of the lesson. Teachers must carefully look into performance-based tasks and outputs because this competency level requires them to create something new out from their learning. More so, teachers must refer to the list of verbs suggested by the taxonomy of learning, but must be careful in interpreting the whole competency rather than just relying to the verbs and what the verbs tell. Lesson developers must be critical in understanding, interpreting, and deciding the level of competency since there are competencies that use verbs classified in the lower level, but the competency requirement as a whole is higher. When we understand the competencies and how it works, teachers can easily design appropriate lessons, create meaningful opportunities for learners to do the tasks, and provide appropriate assessment that will develop holistically to become competent individuals. Learning is always a process of changing the mindset and the practices that becomes the way of living. Tony Robbins believed that if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten.